Imagine measuring the durability of a political system not by its legal framework, military capacity, or electoral rituals, but by the continuous visibility of a single individual. Imagine a state whose coherence depends less on laws or procedures and more on the physical, audible, and symbolic presence of one person. Now consider what happens when that presence is abruptly removed, through force, exile, illness, or circumstance. In such cases, the state does not merely experience turbulence, it begins to lose definition. What follows is not always immediate chaos, but something quieter and more revealing. Hesitation, repetition, and paralysis. The system continues to move, yet no longer knows why it moves, who authorizes it, or where its limits lie. Modern political thinking trains us to see states as impersonal systems. We assume authority is distributed across institutions, that procedures replace personalities, and that continuity is built into bureaucratic design. This belief is deeply ingrained, particularly in societies that have invested heavily in administrative redundancy and legal formalism. But this assumption does not hold everywhere. In certain political environments, the state is not an architecture, it is an extension of a person. Power does not circulate through institutions and return through accountability mechanisms. It radiates outward from a single center and flows back to that center for confirmation. In these systems, ministries operate, courts issue rulings, and media outlets broadcast as usual, but only under one condition. The central figure remains present and unquestioned. Authority exists, but it is borrowed rather than owned. The moment that central presence is disrupted, something unusual occurs. Orders still circulate, but they lack conviction. Statements are issued, but they repeat familiar language without adaptation. Officials delay decisions not because they oppose action, but because they no longer know which actions are permitted. The appearance of control remains intact, even as real control quietly drains away. This phenomenon is not primarily ideological, nor is it a simple moral failure. It is structural. When loyalty becomes more valuable than competence, when decision-making is centralized beyond any redundancy, and when institutions exist only to transmit personal authority rather than exercise independent judgment, resilience disappears. What remains is a brittle order that appears strong precisely because it has never been required to function without its center. The unsettling implication is that some political systems are not designed to survive leadership disruption. They endure only as long as the individual at the apex remains visible, audible, and unquestioned. Remove that individual, and the system does not transition. It stalls. And within that stall emerges something more dangerous than disorder, a vacuum where legitimacy, authority, and direction should be. The real question is not whether such systems are stable. It is whether they ever functioned as states in the institutional sense at all. At the level of global politics, this issue matters because the international order rests on assumptions that extend beyond borders. It depends on continuity, predictability, and responsibility. States are treated as enduring actors capable of honoring agreements, managing crises, and exercising authority beyond the fate of any one leader. When that assumption proves false, the consequences do not remain internal. Leader-centered systems introduce a form of systemic risk into the international environment. Their apparent stability masks a fragility that markets, allies, and rivals often underestimate. As long as a central figure remains firmly in place, such states appear coherent. Contracts are signed, borders are managed, and diplomatic engagements proceed. But when continuity is broken, the state's capacity to act as a reliable participant in the global system collapses abruptly rather than gradually. This has immediate economic implications. Modern economies are interconnected not only through trade, but through confidence. Energy markets, shipping routes, commodity pricing, and financial exposure all rely on the assumption that counterparties will exist tomorrow in roughly the same form they exist today. When authority evaporates overnight, prices do not adjust smoothly. They gap. Risk premiums surge not because of ideology or morality, but because no one knows who is empowered to decide, guarantee, or enforce. Power relations shift in more subtle ways as well. Leader-centered states do not dissolve into neutrality. They become negotiable. External actors suddenly find themselves dealing not with a coherent sovereign entity, but with fragments, military hierarchies, interim administrations, informal networks, or externally backed figures. Influence flows toward whoever can provide order, liquidity, or recognition. This occurs not through conquest, but through leverage. These moments test the credibility of the international system itself. Global norms presume institutional continuity. Diplomatic recognition, legal obligations, and multilateral coordination all depend on the idea that states persist through internal change. When that persistence fails, the system improvises. Precedents blur. Rules bend. What was once considered exceptional becomes quietly normalized. Over time, the cumulative effect is erosion. Markets and governments learn to discount formal structures and focus instead on personalities, alliances, and contingency planning. Stability becomes conditional. Cooperation becomes transactional. The global system grows more reactive and less predictable, not because actors seek disorder, but because resilience has been replaced by improvisation. In a world already strained by high debt, tight energy margins, and geopolitical competition, systems that cannot survive leadership disruption do not merely fail internally. They export instability. Each such failure adds pressure to an international order that assumes shocks can be absorbed without transformation. That assumption becomes harder to sustain with each repetition. To understand how systems reach this point, it is necessary to step back from individual crises and examine long-term patterns. Leader-centered systems rarely begin that way. They often emerge from periods of instability, economic collapse, social fragmentation, external pressure, or institutional weakness. In these moments, concentration of power is justified as a temporary necessity. Fragmented authority is blamed for disorder. Institutions are portrayed as corrupt, inefficient, or captured by elites. Centralization promises decisiveness and protection. Over time, executive authority expands to compensate for institutional fragility. Courts are streamlined, legislatures sidelined, and security structures consolidated. Each step is framed as corrective rather than transformative. The critical shift occurs when emergency measures cease to be reversible. Temporary authority becomes habitual. Loyalty is rewarded more than competence because loyalty feels safer in uncertain environments. Institutions are no longer expected to restrain power, only to transmit it. Formal structures remain, but their function changes. They validate decisions rather than generate them. Economic pressures accelerate this transformation. Resource dependence, sanctions, or external financial stress often reinforce centralization. When access to revenue becomes politically mediated, economic survival depends on proximity to power rather than adherence to rules. Informal networks expand as formal institutions atrophy. Decision-making becomes opaque, not because secrecy is strategic, but because transparency would reveal how little autonomy exists below the top. Over time, the leader becomes indispensable not only politically, but administratively. Decisions once handled by agencies are escalated upward. Crisis management relies on personal intervention. This creates an illusion of control while erasing redundancy. The system functions efficiently only when the leader is present. Without that presence, it cannot operate. Such systems often endure longer than expected because they suppress visible collapse. They control narratives, limit competition, and maintain surface order. But endurance is not resilience. Resilience requires distributed authority, institutional memory, and the ability to adapt without singular command. Leader-centered systems sacrifice all three. By the time disruption arrives, erosion is already complete. What appears sudden from the outside is the delayed result of long-term choices. Economic fragility in these systems is structural. Debt accumulation becomes a political tool rather than an economic strategy. Borrowing stabilizes loyalty rather than productivity. Creditors continue financing as long as they believe control will hold. When that belief falters, refinancing costs spike or access disappears. Inflation follows a similar logic. Monetary policy becomes subordinate to political necessity. Money creation fills gaps left by declining revenue or sanctions, sustaining spending in the short term while eroding purchasing power over time. Trade relationships narrow as political alignment determines access. Sanctions or informal barriers concentrate exports and imports among fewer partners, increasing vulnerability. Capital responds quickly. Domestic wealth seeks safety abroad. Foreign investment becomes speculative rather than developmental. When leadership disruption occurs, capital does not wait to assess intentions. It exits because the mechanisms that once provided reassurance no longer exist. Resource wealth can delay reckoning, but it deepens decay. When revenue flows directly to the center of power, incentives to diversify disappear. The economy becomes simpler, less adaptive, and more exposed to price swings. Resource income stabilizes authority, not economic structure. When disruption finally occurs, economic consequences are nonlinear. Currencies collapse because trust evaporates. Supply chains stall because approvals lose meaning. Inflation accelerates as coordination breaks down. What had been managed dysfunction becomes uncontained crisis. The cost of apparent stability, long financed through debt, inflation, and extraction, comes due all at once. Geography shapes how these crises unfold externally. States located near strategic corridors, sea lanes, or energy routes attract attention regardless of politics. Uncertainty spreads outward through insurance premiums, military planning, and diplomatic recalibration. Leader-centered control over armed forces produces rigidity. When authority weakens, militaries hesitate between autonomy and paralysis. Alliances based on personal relationships evaporate when personalities vanish. Institutional frameworks, if absent, leave states exposed to negotiation from weakness. The immediate aftermath of leadership disruption is often disorientation rather than collapse. Authority exists but cannot act coherently. Officials hesitate, policies contradict each other, informal power centers emerge. Markets respond to uncertainty with volatility. Ordinary citizens experience gradual degradation, unstable prices, insecure employment, deteriorating services. Over time, skilled labor migrates, informal economies expand, and inequality widens. There are several possible trajectories. In the most favorable case, a transitional authority restores basic continuity and credibility quickly enough to stabilize expectations. In more ambiguous outcomes, surface order returns without deep institutional repair, creating dependency and fragile stability. In the worst cases, fragmentation persists, authority divides, and the state survives in name while exporting instability. What these paths share is a central truth. Systems built around singular authority can appear decisive and efficient for long periods. But that efficiency is achieved by stripping away buffers. When pressure arrives, there is nothing left to flex. Uncertainty is not imposed from outside. It is embedded within the design. What remains unresolved is whether resilience can be rebuilt once it has been traded away for stability. Structural transformation is slow, uneven, and rarely intentional. It is shaped as much by what has been lost as by what can still be constructed. In a global system under strain, these limits matter not because disorder is inevitable, but because they remind us that control is never absolute. What endures are structures. And when those structures are thin, uncertainty is not an anomaly. It is the condition to which systems eventually return.